So let's unpack what happens across this disaster cycle. Okay, let's think about where we might put our resources in terms of preparedness and mitigation, what our response might look like, and what our recovery might look like. As I've already said, all of this requires resource, and it's very important to understand that a country's development level is likely to dominate, or at least have some control over how successful any part of the hazard mitigation cycle we're likely to undertake will be. But for now, let's consider what the constituent parts of these different quadrants of the hazard cycle would require. So if we start with preparedness, so thinking about what can we measure, what can we know that will allow us to make forecasts and predictions about particular hazards which might lead to particular disasters. And here there are some really important ideas around timescales and predictability. So if we ask a broad spectrum of people who research natural hazards, I think the consensus would be that actually earthquakes are the least predictable. They tend to occur instantaneously with very, very little warning, very little foreshadowing, and have consequences that are extremely rapidly felt. So often people get a few seconds to a few tens of seconds of warning from a large earthquake in a more developed country, so in the global north. On the other hand, something like a hurricane, typically we have a few hours and more like maybe a few days of warning as the system builds and develops and computer models start predicting where the hurricane might make landfall. So in one sense, monitoring of earthquakes is not going to be particularly effective in terms of reducing risk. On the other hand, weather models, observations of rainfall and wind speed are likely to potentially have a profound effect, particularly in places like the US, where people have the resources to rehouse, re-evacuate in the short term. There's a huge UN program actually under construction, actually under development as we speak, called Early Warnings for All. It's actually worth about 4 billion euros, I think. And it's a global attempt to make sure that early warning systems are in place for lots of different types of natural hazards. It's a really wonderful idea. And it speaks to this idea that for most hazards, so volcanoes, droughts, hurricanes, to a lesser extent, in fact to a negligible extent, tsunamis and earthquakes, which are both instant, unforecastable events, it speaks to the idea that actually if we monitor these systems, then we're likely to understand those systems better and we might have a better chance of making predictions. In my world, in volcanology, forecasting and prediction has always been a bit of a sort of, it's been taboo, if you like, until very, very recently, where we started to get enough data to actually start to see patterns and maybe begin to make adroit and defensible predictions. We have to be a little bit careful as scientists, actually. There are some really difficult stories around the L'Aquila earthquake in Italy, where the earthquake wasn't predicted, despite the fact that people claimed that it could have been, and several scientists went on trial and could have spent their lives in prison for not making the right decision. So there is this backdrop of actual risk to scientists about making these decisions. But an early warning system that's functioning well is likely to give us, in the context of volcanoes, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, maybe hours to days. And actually that is enough time to get people out of harm's way, in terms of hurricane to board up shops and businesses, prepare evacuation, get relief in place. So if people need water and food, you can get it close by. So when the event is over, you can get resources to people very, very quickly. All of this stuff depends on the level of development of a country. If we take a step back in time and look at mitigation, here we would be thinking about infrastructure, land use planning, that typically operates on longer timescales than political lifetimes, if you like. So it's quite a challenge, particularly in the global south, where there might be a churn in quick changes in the politics of a particular country, to be able to develop institutes and institutions, national institutions, that look at sort of like 5, 10, 15, 20-year time horizons. And that's what's required for things like land use planning. You know, no, we shouldn't build a road here despite the fact that the road is useful because it goes too close to an active fault or a volcanic ravine. And these things are challenging politically because you're always saying no to things, right? No, you can't, you know, get that close to the volcano to grow coffee or build a house or a hacienda or whatever. It's always a blunt tool with which to manage a situation. Adroit land use planning is incredibly important in hazard mitigation, but it is really the missing part of most disaster management, if you like. The term we should be really using is DRR, that's disaster risk reduction. And that involves doing things on short timescales and things on longer timescales. One of the things we can note about resource allocation for disasters is that it's much more politically straightforward, but also much easier to raise money in response to a disaster than it is for preparedness. Okay, this is true in lots of fields outside of hazards, things like medicine, for example. We should go to our doctor more regularly rather than only go when we feel ill. The same is true in hazard mitigation. So we should be investing in long-term challenges like evacuation routes, long-term land use planning, mitigation in terms of observations, developing early warning. All of that is resource intensive and hard to fund by many states, but also by charities, whereas as soon as there's a disaster, it's extremely easy, relatively speaking, to raise a lot of money. And the gearing between the amount of money spent on preparedness and mitigation and response is typically 1,000, maybe sometimes even 10,000 to 1, which if you think about it is pretty extraordinary.